I first request, first of all, the speakers will make brief presentations. And Dr. Ayesha Jalal is much more interested in interactive session, and I fully agree with her. And I hope that she will cut short her longer lecture and will come to just 5 to 7 minute speech. And Dr. Akmal Hussain has a longer presentation. He will also be cutting on that so that awam se sikha jaye. Let us learn from the people. And they are not people also. Thank you very much.
You want me to speak for 5 minutes?
Please, that's 7 minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Imtiaz Alam Saab. I have had 4-day notice to give a keynote lecture, which was meant to be for 30 minutes. Now it's going to be 5 minutes. You want to change your mind? I'll make it to 2 minutes.
No, we're going to have 15 minutes. Come on.
Well,
you should prepare.
Well, I mean, in 4 days, it's hard to prepare a keynote lecture. When I'm asked to give a keynote lecture, I'm given a lot of more time. But given the subject and everybody has ideas on it, I thought it would be a better idea to just set it up for you, and so that we can be more interactive, and there are people here who would like to add or subtract from what I've said. Well, on the occasion of the 65th independence anniversary of India and Pakistan, first of all, happy birthday, Pakistan and India. In the early 1950s, a major science conference in New Delhi described the separation of Burma, India, and Pakistan as a geological, geographical, and economic crime that flew in the face of nature and was unlikely to last for more than a century or two. Similar portents have been made repeatedly by others, less apt than scientists to take a detached view of political history. More recently, the tsunami of 2004, followed by the devastating earthquake of October 2005, which hit Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan, dramatically underlined the connectedness, the interconnectedness of a region divided by arbitrary frontiers drawn by the departed colonial masters. There are innumerable other pointers to the inherent organic unity of the region that cut against the grain of the dominant nationalist narratives of the nation-states of South Asia. And my colleague here, Akmal, will certainly give us a lot more on the economic front, which I think he's the best suited to do for today's purpose. Now, far from facilitating the cooperative regional accommodation of the sort that Imtiaz just spoke about, based on recognition of their shared destiny, such signs have only served to strengthen the resolve of Britain's erstwhile colonies to defend their national sovereignty at all costs, whatever that means. Whatever the military masters of Myanmar had to gain from isolationism in an age of globalization, I think it's clear that India and Pakistan, despite their much doubted nuclear prowess, have lost much by their dogged refusal to arrive at some sort of understanding in the larger interests of the common destiny of the South Asian region. The combined weight of the political, economic, and environmental challenges facing the subcontinent requires bold and imaginative, out-of-the-box solutions. This has been all the more urgent, I believe, strongly, in the light of America's apparent determination, it seems, to take on the role of global policeman perpetually in pursuit of its national security interests. It reminds me of a piece that I've just come across by Mr. Bhutto in 1968. He spoke about the U.S.'s police punch policy, give economic incentives, and after that slam your national security interests on whichever part of the world you happen to be involved with at that time. So there is an issue with the way America handles its national security interests, a debate that needs to be taken perhaps there. There are those who believe, and with growing credence, that the future balance of global power is going to be determined by policies adopted by key actors in the Indian Ocean regional space rather than in either the Atlantic or the Pacific Oceanic arenas. This is a major claim. Some analysts, of course, we know, have gone so far as to say that Washington has far more stake in preserving the state failure in Pakistan than in stabilizing either Afghanistan or, for that matter, Iraq or whatever other country that comes to mind. New Delhi and its backers in Washington have been skeptical about this line, arguing that this only emboldens Pakistan to take on more and more extreme lines. And I mean, this is on the basis of what its ambitious high command wants, which could be similar to covert operations of the sort that took place in Kargil, or even more controversially and tragically, the Mumbai 2008 model. Without a resolution of the long-standing Kashmir dispute, the gap between Pakistan's perceptions of its long-term security requirements vis-à-vis both India and Afghanistan and American strategic interests in the region, has been very difficult to negotiate, far less bridge. Without Kashmir being sorted out and with Afghanistan remaining unaddressed. As the Americans contemplate their departure from Afghanistan, I think, and I agree here again with Mr. Alam, that it is imperative, more imperative than ever for both Islamabad and New Delhi to get the right end of the stick so as not to repeat the mistakes of the past vis-à-vis both each other as well as in relation to Kabul. The present historical conjuncture, therefore, represents a very rare opportunity for the two subcontinental neighbors to start a new chapter in their relationship. I don't just say this for the sake of rhetoric. I think it's an actual reality based on what I see as the reality on the ground. Whatever their formal stance, I think there are serious misgivings in both capitals about U.S. designs. Ambitious in conception and insensitive to other people's national sentiments, the American strategic doctrine in its various formulations essentially effectively invites the International Committee of Nations to dispense with their military and independent foreign policies by limiting interstate rivalries to commercial activities and leaving matters of global security, broadly speaking, in safe American hands. Now, ever since the unveiling of the more extreme versions of this doctrine under the Bush administration, the Western Academy has been rife with comparisons between the Roman Empire and the new American empire, as it were. Apart from being utterly premature, ahistorical, such comparisons take a very exaggerated view of what America's military superiority can achieve and belittle the significance of opposition to an empire that has yet to be fully established. The turmoil in Iraq, in the wake of an American victory, so-called, has more than adequately exemplified or amplified the limits of military power. If not quite an age of empire, Washington's military intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq ushered in what I call a wave of global opposition. The frantic readjustments made in several European capitals in response to Washington's unilateralism signaled the need for the nation-states of Asia and the two nuclear states of South Asia in particular to go beyond their expressed wariness of the doctrine of preemptive action against anything and everything that threatens American interests. Any effective response will have to be based on a balanced assessment of the likely success or future of the American design, which, of course, of the new global order, which is in the making as we speak. Europe has taken the lead somewhat in actually resisting some of the American designs. I think France is a country that has done that quite effectively. In closer to home, I would say that Turkey is beginning to show very effective signs of going in a divergent way from what the U.S. Policy has been. The predominant mood, however, in the subcontinent, despite the rapidly changing international environment, has been that this has not affected our policy-hardened policymakers sitting in the secretariat walls of New Delhi, South Bloc in particular, and Islamabad. On the face of it, events since September 11th appear to have taken an even heavier toll on the proverbial failure of will and lack of vision so characteristic of the policymakers of both capitals. Yes, yet as the broader societal and political level, I think, and this is again a point that was made, and I think this is something that you can find just by walking on the streets of Lahore and in Amritsar, where I was recently, that there is a recognition that if India and Pakistan are not to be swept away by the imperatives of the new global order, cynics call it the new global disorder, they will have to rethink themselves anew and begin building bridges again across their age-old divides. What is lacking, however, I believe, is a clear vision that might enable the two rivals to achieve some semblance of peace and stability in the pursuit of greater security and prosperity for the region as a whole. Washington may harbor Xerxes' grand illusions of a Persian empire, but can hardly be unaware of the devastating outcome of the enterprise. To be sure, India and Pakistan are no modern-day Athens and Sparta, any more than Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, and the Maldives are the small Greek city-states who in 480 BC managed to overcome their internal difficulties and differences to inflict a crushing defeat on a more numerous and better equipped Persian force. The best they can do is to draw lessons from that glorious moment in Hellenic history that made the independence and prosperity of not just Greece, but I might add also of Europe, possible. Instead of showing signs of wanting to fend off imperialistic designs on their resources and strategic assets, India and Pakistan have both mostly vied with each other to win American support in the war against Al-Qaeda. I think that's something that has to be underlined. Military-dominated Pakistan has been in the American pocket for the better part of its history, and having fallen out of it briefly in the 1980s over the nuclear question, was only too willing to dance to the tune of the old paymaster once the tide turned against the Taliban in Afghanistan. India, by contrast, has come a long way from its Cold War view of America as a blundering giant, devoid of finer feelings or respect for Asian sentiment in its desire to dominate others through its might or its wealth. The coalition led by the BJP not so long ago, while occasionally fuming at American policies for domestic consumption, was no less eager, if you recall, to tie the knot of an everlasting strategic partnership with the United States. The present Congress government in New Delhi, which likes to parade its Nehruvian legacy of non-alignment to keep alive the nationalist mantra of non-alignment, has been careful not to allow its growing ties with Washington endanger or seem to endanger India's economic self-interests. For all the talk about India and Pakistan grasping the nettle and starting afresh, there can be no wishing away the impress left by a long and contentious history on subcontinental minds. I would argue that in many ways the difficulty that India and Pakistan face in finding a solution is because not only does history weigh heavily on their minds, I think Indians and Pakistanis are conditioned in a way not to be able to learn from history in a way that might enable them to find more creative solutions for the present. So it's not just what happened in the past to India and Pakistan, which you referred to earlier, but how you remember it, what you make of it, how you think of it. That is what has made it difficult to break away. So I think what is most important for India and Pakistan is to realize the primary issues. I just want to give you a few examples because I don't want to harp. There is a prepared piece, but I'm going to diverge from that. The primary problem in Pakistan has been that they believe very strongly that India has never come to terms with the creation of Pakistan. It is this policy that justifies a national security paradigm that Pakistan constructed, I would argue, as early as the late 40s, which has remained by and large unchanged. If anything, it has morphed into a much, much more rigid paradigm than it was initially intended to do, which was that India is unreconciled to Pakistan, and therefore we must ensure against Indian designs at all costs, even if it means cutting off our own nose to spite our face. That's basically been the policy. And so that means that what does it tell you? That India wants to take over Pakistan is the view, and we must prevent that from happening. Now, the tragedy of that line is that I don't want to harp on my analysis of partition, but I will say that my findings suggested that, if anything, the Muslim League's demand for Pakistan was so problematic for the Congress High Command that it preferred to split India, divide, and get rid of the Muslims rather than share power. Now, the question that raises is, will they want it to come back in bits and pieces to return to India, as Pakistanis have always feared? Now, the question is that would deeply be problematic for India's Muslim question. I don't see how India would possibly want, after having solved the Muslim problem in 1947, to invite the return of the Muslim, to completely upset the Indian political balance. So I do think that this misconception that India is just waiting, either through the economic means or through other military means, to take over, has been the great fallacy that Pakistanis have been brought up with. But if you think hard about it, why the hell would India want you? Other than, India might want to keep you weak, but you have nothing but the prospect of fearsome Taliban, and with a friend like Imtiaz Alam, you would be really scared all the time about the threat that they pose, because that's what he harps on a lot. I'm referring to my Indian friends. So the point is that why would India want to take over? And in that respect, I just want to remind you that the whole policy, I mean, if we go back to history, since I am a historian and there may not be an opportunity to bring this up again, if you take the long view of history on the relationship with Afghanistan, on the border, the question of the border, the Durand Line, the policy by and large was keep the tribes happy and keep the frontier protected. When it came to the question of Pakistan, the Congress High Command, for all its desire to stand up for the Congress government and the NWFP, saw wisdom in not rocking the boat and letting NWFP, then NWFP, now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, join Pakistan. Pakistan's entire policy was to use the Muslim card, the fact that there was a common bond with the tribesmen, to its advantage. The British had to pay huge quantities of money to keep these guys satisfied. Of course, Pakistan continued that policy, but did take advantage in the initial years, and in fact for several decades, of the tribesmen by and large disposition, pro-Muslim disposition. They had certainly no desire to join India. So the question here is that I'm referring to, now that we talk about America departing and Pakistan and America being in a zero-sum game, and India being in a zero-sum game in Afghanistan, and we have a specialist sitting right there, Ahmed is sitting in the back, Ahmed Rashid, who knows much more than I do about this. I can only say that it makes no sense given the longer history. The longer history was to keep the frontier, which was always restive, basically happy, which meant that it would be easier rather than the tribesmen having to deal with non-Muslim governments, it would be easier for them to deal with Muslim governments. So I think that this notion now that this has become a major problem between the two countries requires some reference to history, just in little parts, little bits. Two people I would like to quote. 6 years before Pakistan appeared on the map of the world, Pakistan's founding father, none other than Muhammad Ali Jinnah, denounced the Indian National Congress and right-wing Hindu organizations for hysterically treating the proposed Muslim homeland as if it was a nightmare or some dangerous animal. Pakistan has been there for centuries, he claimed. It is there to stay today. It is there today, and it will remain till the end of the world. It was taken away from us. No one could prevent Muslims from claiming what is our own. Jinnah saw no inconsistency in making an apparently separatist claim to territories in the northwest and northeast of India and vowing never to let Muslim minorities elsewhere in the subcontinent becoming vassalized by the Hindu majority. At the same time, he emphatically rejected concerns about Pakistan's inability to ward off a potential invasion from the northwest. European powers, including our British masters, invaded India from the coasts. Air and not land or sea power had in any case become the decisive weapon in modern warfare. Hindus and Muslims had to live as good neighbors and jointly tell the world, hands off India, India for the Indians, unquote. While warning against attempts to bring about a forced union between the two countries, which he always referred to as Pakistan and Hindustan, and not Pakistan and India. India, of course, included both Pakistan and Hindustan. Jinnah made it plain that Pakistan was, quote, always ready to come to an understanding or enter into agreements with Hindustan as two independent, equal sovereign states, in the same way as we may have our alliances, friendships, and agreements with any other foreign nation. Now, the difficulty, of course, has been that these ideas, the notion of Pakistan's, sort of chronic hostility from India, Pakistan being on the receiving end here, has made it very difficult for new ways of thinking ahead. India hasn't made life easy either for Pakistan. As the larger neighbor, it could have been expected to show much more maturity, if not generosity, in handling these border issues, whether it was the question of Kashmir, which I'd like to come to a little later, but also the handling of the current situation as it is unfolding in Afghanistan. In this respect, I think it is worth reminding ourselves on the question of Afghanistan, the words of none other than the poetic visionary of Pakistan, Muhammad Iqbal, who had anticipated the potential dangers from a restive tribal belt bordering Afghanistan when he rejected criticisms that his proposal for a Muslim state, which he enunciated in his Allahabad address in 1930, would weaken India's frontiers, would leave India indefensible. And I think this is extremely important for our current scenario. In fact, Iqbal argued it would eventually solve the problem of India as well as of Asia, since a series of contented and well-organized Muslim provinces on the northwest frontier of India would be the bulwark of India against the hungry generation of the Asiatic mainlands. Unquote. So the point is that here again we have another different perspective which has been lost sight of in the obsessive dimension of nation states and how they envisage their national security. If you take a longer view of the history of the region to try to come to terms with how matters could be settled, I think the question of the frontier, which was always at the forefront for the minds of, for several key minds of the subcontinent prior to partition, I think you can go back and find some answers there. But of course, there's an intrinsic connection, at least in the Pakistani mind, between the problem of the very pressing problem of an American presence in Afghanistan, which casts a very long shadow on something else that matters very greatly to Pakistan, not because of rhetorical reasons alone, but because it is a real issue, and that is the ongoing humanitarian tragedy in Kashmir, which really poses a major challenge. So they are connected. There's always been an intrinsic connection between Afghanistan and Kashmir in the Pakistani mind ever since its inception in 1947. Of course, there have been major changes, but there's no time to talk about that. So the question is that even today, that the link is there. The issue is, why is there such an inability on the part of India and Pakistan to come to terms with Kashmir? I do think that the earlier, the main problem has been that Kashmir is treated as a real estate dispute, as a territorial dispute, not about how the people of that region can be accommodated within the rubric of India, or for that matter, Pakistan. And I think the fear that somehow it will mean Kashmir being given to Pakistan, or Pakistan fearing that it will be formally absorbed, is becoming, has been the major problem. But there's no reason why we need to think about Kashmir in those ways as well. Again, a reference to history will teach you that the problem of Kashmir, first of all, is a very modern creation, first of all. It was created in 1846 at the time of the Amritsar Treaty. With the end of the Sikh state. Is there a problem? Sorry, I was trying to understand what's going on. So Kashmir too is a recent problem. It was and has been aggravated by the nature of the decolonization process. But the real issue that has finally, which has really been the root cause of India and Pakistan's nightmare, has been the issue of a rather thoughtless borrowing in the first instance, and then embracing in a very major way a concept of sovereignty that was developed in Europe for European purposes, and which Indians and Pakistanis have absorbed and made it into their sacred emblem. And this is the non-negotiable idea of sovereignty, where sovereignty is monolithic, it is non-negotiable, whereas if you look at the history of the subcontinent based on shared and layered sovereignty, I mean, the Mughal emperor was the Shehenshah, but everybody else was an emperor and a king, even down to the village level. This idea was eliminated by the British. They did the same in the case of Kashmir. Kashmir too was an artificially created state after 1846, and its power stemmed from getting rid of the lower levels of power. The Dogra state built itself on that basis. Now that notion of unshared sovereignty to be exercised for the benefit of, in this instance, a dynasty or a few, has resulted in a scenario where the European idea of a monolithic sovereignty has become divorced from a more popular idea of sovereignty, an idea of sovereignty that keeps pace with the people's aspirations. The moment sovereignty becomes divorced from what people feel is legitimate rule, that sovereignty becomes more of a kind of an idea that needs to be put into a museum. It's not a live idea anymore. And India and Pakistan are both really stuck to this old idea of sovereignty at all costs. If you look at the dominant narratives in both countries, it's about sovereignty, and nobody gets up and says, well, what are you really talking about? In the case of Pakistan, taking American aid or Western aid and then talking about sovereignty is a long stretch. A country that pays 9% of its people pay tax, the rest comes in aid or has come for several years. It doesn't make much sense to talk about sovereignty. But what I'm trying to point out is sovereignty is intrinsically related to the aspirations of the people, and they change. And the challenge for those who are exercising sovereignty need to ensure that they are able to have credibility, legitimacy. So simply being stuck to an idea of sovereignty that cannot be changed, where any assertion of regional dissidence or any assertion of regional aspiration is called secessionist or treason, that's a major problem in the thinking of this part of the world. It has something to do with politics of expediency. Partition would never have happened if the Congress had been prepared to have a more shared idea of sovereignty. And that was what really the Cabinet Mission Plan was all about. But that was rejected. It was rejected because you couldn't really share sovereignty. You couldn't have layers and layers of sovereignty. The Cabinet Mission Plan was based on a three-tiered system, federal at the top, provinces, groups of provinces in the second layer, and then, of course, the actual provinces at the bottom. But it was not allowed to work because it was deemed to be impracticable. Now, I think you might say that it has been better for India and Pakistan to be completely separated, etc., and all. But the issue here is that the idea of sovereignty intrinsically related, I mean, a non-negotiable monolithic sovereignty related to hostility between India and Pakistan, a zero-sum kind of a scenario, has resulted in deep stresses not only within India, in this instance vis-a-vis Kashmir. I mean, there are others. There was earlier, there was Punjab, there's been Assam, there are many other parts that have also had their problems with the central government. But in the case of Pakistan, because it's a smaller country, because it came about in 47, there is a sense that any amount of weakening or altering of the old idea of sovereignty domestically will result in a breakup of Pakistan, whether it's Balochistan, whether it's Sindh. But in the case of India, Kashmir has become India's great sort of emblem of India's ability to hold together. It's an ironic scenario. By sticking to a non-negotiable attitude towards sovereignty, the Kashmiri people talk about azadi. What does that azadi mean? Azadi means many things. Azadi doesn't necessarily mean that you want a flag that you want to fly in the UN, have a separate seat. Azadi is a state of mind. Azadi is the sense of being free in your own home to carry on your life and build a life that is consistent with your aspirations. That is azadi. But the impossibility of allowing this popular conception of Kashmiri sovereignty to really sort of be reconciled with the broader Indian rigid idea of sovereignty, which is propagated by South Bloc and, of course, many other bureaucracies in India, has made it very difficult for India and Pakistan to move on. The lack of a graciousness in the case of India towards Kashmir has to do with, is related to the Indo-Pakistan hostility. But if we are able to move on, both recognizing that sovereignty does change, even Europe, the very originator of a monolithic, non-negotiable Westphalian idea of sovereignty, is today talking about shared common unions. There is no reason why we have to be more holier than the Europeans when it comes to ideas of sovereignty. Sovereignty is an idea. It changes with time. It is nothing hollow. It's not a. It becomes hollow only if you realize and argue that it is simply a thing. Sovereignty cannot change. Sovereignty is about what people think about a sovereign nation. Does it have credibility? Does it have legitimacy? So I think that by abandoning their old analytical equipment, both countries and both bureaucracies in particular can learn a great deal. That's what academicians do. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've all been upgrading our analytical equipment. Nobody thinks about nation states and their boundaries as completely inviolable or unchangeable. They do change because they have to compromise, they have to be negotiated. Sovereignty too has to be reconsidered. The Soviet Union has reconsidered its sovereignty. There's no reason why Kashmir cannot be accommodated within the rubric of the pre-existing nation states of South Asia, the subcontinental South Asia, with the Kashmiris feeling that they have got their azadi. It could be on the model of a Quebec model, even though the Quebec model was rejected. But the idea of a sovereignty association, which does not take anything away from India's sovereignty or Pakistan's, is one way forward. I think similar sorts of arrangements will have to be made on Afghanistan as well. But the issue of sovereignty and the arrogance of the nation states in this regard is becoming a great detriment to future of peace and recognition of the common shared destiny. There is so much more to be said, and I don't want to hinder an interactive dialogue with you or to prevent others from talking about the many challenges we face in the subcontinent, environmental, economic, that in many ways are much greater, even if we get all our political arguments in place and we are willing to compromise, the challenges we face are greater than our political differences. Thank you very much.